What if the world's first city wasn't in Egypt? Not in Mesopotamia, not in Greece, but hidden beside an ancient oasis in the Middle East. A city so old that it existed before writing, before kings, before recorded history itself. A city whose walls rose thousands of years before the pyramids. A city destroyed, rebuilt, abandoned, and reborn again and again. A city surrounded by mystery, controversy, and one of archaeology's greatest debates. Was Jericho truly the first city on Earth? Or is there a hidden chapter of history we've yet to uncover? Tonight, we journey back nearly 11,000 years to investigate one of humanity's oldest and most fascinating mysteries. Before we dive into the main story, please kindly follow our page, like, comment and share. Also subscribe to our channel for more interesting video like this. This is the story of Jericho. Imagine standing in a harsh and unforgiving landscape. Dry hills stretch toward the horizon. The sun beats down relentlessly. Water is scarce. Survival is difficult. Then suddenly, you discover an oasis. Fresh water. Fertile soil. For ancient humans, such places were priceless. And one of the most important oases in human history lay near the Jordan Valley. Today it is known as Jericho. Archaeologists call the ancient mound at its center Tel Sultan. At first glance, it appears to be an ordinary hill. But beneath that hill lie the remains of thousands of years of human occupation. Layer upon layer. Generation upon generation. Civilization stacked upon civilization. A historical archive written not on paper, but in earth. To understand why Jericho matters, we must travel back to a time when cities did not exist. Most humans lived as hunter-gatherers. Small groups moved across landscapes searching for food. There were no nations, no empires, no governments, no permanent urban centers. Life revolved around movement. People followed resources. They adapted to changing environments. Then something extraordinary happened. Near the end of the last ice age, some groups began settling down. Not because they suddenly became farmers overnight, but because certain locations offered advantages impossible to ignore. Jericho was one of those places. Its natural spring provided reliable water. Wild grains grew nearby. Animals could be hunted in surrounding regions. The location was ideal. And over time, people stayed. When archaeologists began excavating Jericho, they expected ancient remains. What they found was astonishing. Evidence suggested human occupations stretching back nearly 11,000 years. Some structures dated to around 9,000 BC. That means people were living at Jericho not long after the end of the Ice Age. Long before Egypt's pyramids. Long before Sumer. Long before most civilizations commonly taught in schools. The dates shocked researchers. Because they suggested something extraordinary. Urban life may have begun much earlier than previously believed. Then archaeologists uncovered something even more surprising. A massive stone wall. And beside it, a stone tower. The tower stood approximately 8 meters high. Built thousands of years before the great monuments of Egypt. This discovery raised immediate questions. Why would such an early settlement need a wall? Who organized its construction? How many workers were involved? At a time when humanity was supposedly just beginning to settle down, someone had already organized large-scale construction. The implications were profound. For years, many researchers assumed the wall served as protection. Perhaps against enemies. Perhaps against raiders. Perhaps against rival groups competing for resources. It seemed logical. But then alternative explanations emerged. Some archaeologists suggested the wall may have protected the settlement from floods. Others argued it could have served symbolic purposes. Still others proposed social or ceremonial functions. The truth remains uncertain. And that's what makes Jericho so fascinating. One of its most famous structures still resists a definitive explanation. Here's something many people never hear. Jericho's famous tower may be among the oldest large-scale stone monuments ever built by humans. Not in Egypt, not in Mesopotamia, but here, at Jericho. That realization forces us to rethink how advanced early communities may have been. Now we arrive at the controversy. Many documentaries call Jericho the first city on Earth. But not all archaeologists agree. Some argue other ancient settlements compete for that title. Others question whether Jericho's earliest phases truly qualify as a city in the modern sense. Definitions matter. Was it a city? A large settlement? A proto-city? The debate continues today, and there is still no universal agreement. But perhaps the greatest mystery wasn't how Jericho began. It was how it survived. Because over thousands of years, Jericho would face destruction after destruction. Empires would rise. Empires would fall. Invaders would come. Civilizations would disappear. Yet Jericho kept returning. Again and again and again. Do you think Jericho deserves the title of the world's first city? Or do you think another ancient settlement came first? When we left Jericho, humanity was standing at a crossroads. The Ice Age had ended. People were settling near a life-giving oasis. And archaeologists had uncovered evidence suggesting Jericho might be among the oldest continuously inhabited settlements on Earth. But the greatest surprises were still ahead. Because somewhere in this ancient community, humanity began changing forever. People stopped wandering. They started building. And they may have unknowingly started one of the greatest revolutions in human history. The birth of civilization. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans lived as hunter-gatherers. It was the only way of life they knew. Families moved constantly. Food determined movement. The landscape dictated survival. Then something changed. Near Jericho, people discovered they didn't always have to move. The oasis provided fresh water year-round. Wild grains grew naturally. Animals could be hunted nearby. Resources were abundant. For perhaps the first time in history, a community could remain in one place for extended periods. This simple decision would change humanity forever. Imagine waking up one morning and realizing something remarkable. The seeds you dropped months earlier have grown. The plants return. Again and again. People began observing patterns, experimenting, learning. Slowly, humans started cultivating crops. Not overnight, not through a single invention, but through countless generations of observation. Wheat, barley, other early plants. These discoveries transformed everything. Because once food could be produced reliably, population could grow. And when populations grow, societies become more complex. This was the beginning of agriculture, one of the most important developments in human history. As food supplies became more reliable, Jericho expanded. Families built homes close together. Children grew up in permanent communities. Knowledge passed from one generation to the next. People no longer spent all their time searching for food. Some could specialize. Some could build. Some could organize. Some could create. For the first time, society itself began becoming more complex. The foundations of civilization were taking shape. And Jericho stood at the center of this transformation. What was daily life like in Jericho nearly 11,000 years ago? The answer may surprise many viewers. This was not a city filled with kings and palaces. It was a community. Homes were built from mud brick. Families shared resources. People farmed, hunted, crafted tools, and raised children. Yet despite its simplicity, this society represented something revolutionary. Humans were no longer simply surviving. They were building a future. And that future would eventually lead to cities, kingdoms, empires, and modern civilization itself. Here's a hidden fact rarely mentioned. Some archaeologists believe Jericho's population may have reached several hundred or even over 1,000 people during certain periods. That may not sound impressive today, but for the time, it was extraordinary. Communities of that size were almost unheard of. Jericho wasn't merely surviving. It was growing. But as the settlement expanded, a mystery emerged. A mystery built from stone. A structure so unexpected that archaeologists still debate its purpose today. A massive wall. And beside it, a giant tower. Why would one of humanity's earliest settlements need such monumental construction? The answer remains one of archaeology's greatest puzzles. When archaeologists uncovered Jericho's ancient wall, they were stunned. This wasn't a simple fence. It wasn't a temporary barrier. It was a substantial stone structure, built thousands of years before the pyramids, thousands of years before the rise of Egypt, thousands of years before many societies were expected to undertake such projects. The wall suggested organization, planning, leadership, and collective labor on a remarkable scale. The people of Jericho had accomplished something extraordinary. But then came an even bigger surprise. Near the wall stood an enormous stone tower, roughly 8 meters tall, built using thousands of stones. The structure dominates the archaeological site even today. For ancient people, constructing such a monument would have required tremendous effort. Hundreds of workers, careful planning, a shared purpose. But what purpose? The answer remains uncertain. And that's where the mystery begins. The most obvious explanation is defense. Perhaps Jericho faced threats, rival communities, competition over resources, violence, conflict. Walls protect people. Towers provide visibility. The theory makes sense. Yet evidence for large-scale warfare during this period remains limited. That creates a problem. If enemies weren't the primary threat, then what was? Some archaeologists propose a different explanation. Flooding. Jericho sits near natural waterways. Seasonal flooding may have threatened the settlement. A wall could help control water, protect homes, preserve resources. This theory solves some questions, but not all of them, because the tower still remains difficult to explain. Its size suggests significance beyond simple practicality. Something important motivated its construction. Another possibility is symbolism. Imagine the tower rising above the settlement, visible from a distance. A monument to community identity. A statement. A declaration. Perhaps it represented unity. Perhaps authority. Perhaps shared beliefs. Some researchers suggest monumental architecture helped strengthen social cohesion. In other words, the tower may have been less about protection and more about bringing people together. Then comes one of the most fascinating ideas. Could the tower have possessed an astronomical function? Some researchers have suggested alignments connected to the surrounding landscape and celestial events. The evidence remains debated, but the possibility captures the imagination. Because if true, Jericho's builders may have been thinking about far more than survival. They may have been observing the heavens themselves. Here's a fact many viewers never hear. Jericho's tower is among the oldest known monumental stone structures ever discovered. Its existence proves that large-scale construction began far earlier than many historians once believed. In a sense, it foreshadows the pyramids, temples, and monuments that would follow thousands of years later. The controversy is simple. Nobody agrees exactly why the wall and tower were built. Defense? Flood control? Ceremonial purposes? Social organization? Astronomical observation? The evidence supports multiple interpretations. And that's exactly why the mystery survives, even after decades of excavation. But the greatest challenge facing Jericho wasn't construction. It wasn't survival. And it wasn't nature. It was time. Because over the next several thousand years, Jericho would experience destruction after destruction. Civilizations would rise and collapse around it. Invaders would arrive. Entire cultures would disappear. Yet somehow, Jericho kept returning. And again. And again. In Part 2, we'll investigate the astonishing cycle of destruction and rebirth that made Jericho one of the most resilient places in human history. We'll explore the famous biblical controversy, the archaeological evidence, and the mystery that continues to divide historians to this day. Comment below. Why do you think Jericho built its wall and tower? Defense? Flood protection? Religion? Or something history has forgotten? Subscribe now, because the greatest controversy in Jericho's story is still ahead. Thank you for watching. Please kindly follow our page, like, comment and share. Also subscribe to my channel for more interesting historic fact videos.